This is Shane Morris with the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. Today on the BreakPoint podcast, John Stonestreet interviews World Magazine's Mindy Belz about President Trump's alarming announcement that he's pulling U.S. troops out of northern Syria, a move that clears the way for a Turkish invasion of Syria and imperils our Kurdish allies and Syria's remaining Christian population. Mindy Belz is a senior editor at World Magazine and author of They Say We Are Infidels, On the Run from ISIS with Persecuted Christians in the Middle East. Here are John Stonestreet and Mindy Belz.
Welcome to the BreakPoint podcast. In light of the surprise announcement made by President Trump that some 1,000 or so U.S. troops would be withdrawn from Kurdish-controlled regions of Syria, and the immediate reaction that came, not least of which, in fact, most of which, from Republican colleagues, congressmen, Congress leaders who understand the just really what's at stake in that region. I asked my friend Mindy Belz. Mindy, of course, writes for World Magazine, the author of a terrific book, They Say We Are Infidels. And Mindy, of course, has spent much of her career in this region and understands the tensions internationally, particularly in the Middle East. And Mindy, first of all, thanks for joining us. Were you as caught off guard by this announcement as so many people seem to be?
In one sense, yes. I mean, I think the suddenness of President Trump's tweets and statements continually takes us in the news business off guard. On the other hand, there had been some signals starting last week that this was possibly coming. No one expected it to come in the way that it did, with the wording that it contained, and just to the extent of the pivot the United States is making away from the groups that we've been supporting in Syria and toward Turkey.
All right, so a lot of people may be wondering, okay, what's the big deal? We don't want to keep our troops here. Isn't it time for them to come home? That certainly seemed to be the tenor and tone of the president's tweets. So I think we need a good deal of backdrop here, and I know you're able to give us that. So what's been going on in this region? Why was this so surprising?
First of all, I think we do want to sort of puncture the misunderstanding about the extent of U.S. involvement there. The U.S. has had on the ground in northern Syria since about 2015, about 1,000 to 2,000. These are high-level special forces, military advisor types. The challenge throughout this really awful Syrian war has been separating the bad guys from the good guys. And we had increasingly been allied with and actually supporting the Syrian democratic forces who have controlled this northern region. This is in some ways what people have considered like the next best hope for Syria, a group of forces that are comprised of Kurdish, Christian, and Arab militias who have managed to come together despite their ethnic and religious differences, have been fighting and have been the most successful fighters against ISIS. So the U.S. involvement has been incredibly strategic and incredibly important. So without a lot of cost to us in terms of our military engagement, we have been able to have a lot of influence for good in the region through our support for the SDF. The other dimension that I think is really important for your audience to understand, John, is just simply that this region that we're talking about along the border of northern Syria with Turkey is really, it contains the oldest churches in the world. It contains communities of Armenian and Assyrian believers who have been through repeated genocides. And most recently, starting in 2015, when ISIS wiped out several of these villages. And they have been trying to come back, and they have had this tenuous support and have just done a remarkable job at kind of staking a claim again in this area, a protection of some of the oldest Christian sites in the world. That's what's at stake here.
So there's been a status quo, in a sense, kind of held here. We know Turkey's intentions to invade that region. We know that actually is what the president tweeted, that they're going to go forward with that and we're going to get out of the way. Is there any sense at all about what the president is thinking on this? Like why he would want to make this decision?
The short answer to that, I have to say, is no. This is a decision that from almost any angle you look at is precedent setting and incredibly disturbing, because what the president said in his Sunday night statement is that Turkey will move forward and the U.S. will move back, essentially. And so if you look at it from the perspective, and you have to look at a couple of things here. What we've been seeing with Turkey, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, he is an Islamist president who is moving Turkey, which is a NATO ally, as someone said to me this week, in the wrong direction. Turkey is moving in the wrong direction, but it still is a part of NATO. So if you think, okay, this is the U.S. supporting a NATO ally, well, this is a NATO ally moving into Syria, which would not activate any kind of NATO treaty. It does not pose a threat to the NATO alliance at this point. The threat to the NATO alliance coming out of Syria was the ISIS threat.
So one of the things that people are pointing back to is the fateful decision by President Obama to withdraw troops too early, and how that led to a re-emboldened, enemy, basically instability. And many people are saying that is really what we can expect now. We've got ISIS on the run, we've heard ISIS is defeated, and yet we're also hearing that there's an awful lot of ISIS still there. What is the current state of ISIS, and will this decision lead to, we know Turkey's going to invade, but we think, what's going to happen with ISIS here?
I really puzzle over what intelligence briefings President Trump is reading, because ISIS is definitely not finished. And we even saw a bombing attack against a church in Qamishli just a few months ago. We have continued to see these pop-up attacks taking place around these areas in both Syria and Iraq. I would say that ISIS is dispersed at this point. And what I think is really troubling, and what ought to trouble Americans, is that our policymakers, our presidents, seem to keep not learning from history. We saw what happened after President Obama's very sudden, very precipitous pullout from Iraq. It created this vacuum, a security vacuum around Nineveh Plain and Mosul, the very areas that ISIS moved into in 2013. We have seen now that we supported these forces as they fought ISIS. They beat them out of the cities, out of the towns in northeastern Syria. We declared victory, and now we're pulling out. And what's going to happen is we will either see Turkey invade. Turkey, by the way, kept an open border where foreign fighters fled through and linked up with ISIS in Syria for years. Turkey has aligned itself with al-Qaeda-linked militias who are occupying Afrin and other cities in the northwest, at the expense, again, of Christian populations and Kurdish populations and Yazidi populations. So we're seeing a pattern here, and our policymakers know this, and somehow they're ignoring it, and we're watching the same thing happen over again. We're pulling back. We're allowing a vacuum to be created. I believe, people in Syria talk about a second war. I believe that could be what we're on the edge of, is just another war in the region.
Let's talk about specifically Christians. One of the things that you and I have talked about on our podcast and in various ways before is that when there is a opportunism for persecution of Christians, that opportunity tends to be taken. When that sort of vacuum, when that sort of instability, it targets more than just Christians, but Christians are among those that are the most targeted. Tell us about the Christian population there. I know you mentioned some of the oldest churches in the world being in this region, but talk a little bit about who the Christian population is there. And if history, again, repeats itself, I think it was Mark Twain that said it doesn't always repeat itself, but it tends to rhyme. If history rhymes here, what are we going to see?
Right. The Christian population in this region is, dates back to the old churches, the Syriac Orthodox, the Assyrian Church of the East, some of those that have maintained what we would consider an Orthodox liturgy, Orthodox beliefs for thousands of years. And then it also includes, really remarkably, some Kurdish, I would say, evangelical congregations. One of the key moments in the Syrian civil war was a battle that was fought in the city of Kobani, where, again, the Syrian Democratic Forces, combined with a lot of U.S. air power, pushed ISIS out of Kobani. And out of that alliance, there grew a number of Kurdish converts to Christianity, who are meeting in 2, 3, 4 churches in the city of Kobani, these growing congregations. So in some ways, it's an exciting place where if freedom and security is allowed to take hold, we could see a real resurgence of Christianity in this region. Now that looks like it's under threat again. But you have a number of cities and towns that were emptied and destroyed in 2015 by ISIS. ISIS, both, I would say, from a theological and a principial standpoint, has targeted Christian communities. We saw that in Iraq, and we saw it in Syria. But at least they have their hold on those specific towns and villages has been fought back. And so there is an opportunity for stability to come in, but not under Turkish forces, and not if Turkey and Syria, for instance, if we were to see Turkey invade and the Syrian army with backing from Russia respond. These are the kinds of things that we fear will happen with the U.S. stepping away from this region.
So the decision to step away, I mean, the criticism has been, a chorus of individuals. Lindsey Graham, Brett McGurk, Nikki Haley, certainly Mitch McConnell. I mean, it's just from our military voices, it's just one after another, after another, after another. In response, it seems like the president was trying to basically say, well, look, if Turkey does anything, and he said, and I quote, "in my great and unmatched wisdom, considered to be off limits, I will totally destroy and obliterate its economy." And of course, Turkish leaders didn't take any of that seriously at all, said that they reject any sort of threat. It seems like the president is trying to mitigate, as he's been warned, look, this is going to lead to an offensive by the Turkish military. It's going to lead to instability. It's going to lead to a vacuum that's going to be filled by ISIS. There's not a single good reason for this decision to have been made. And it seems like the president is trying to say, well, it's not that bad. Do you think any of the criticism is getting through to the White House and that this decision might be reversed?
I don't have that kind of intel, but I think what you've hit on is that we all are struggling to make sense of this. And you see that in the kind of responses from Republicans that you mentioned. I think that we are entering some unprecedented territory with a president who clearly makes decisions within his own mind or within a very small cadre of advisors. And that's very dangerous when we start talking about foreign policy, we start talking about military troop movements, because these are coordinated endeavors, and they just simply cannot happen apart from coordination with our allies and within our own military. And so, you have the Syrian Democratic forces completely caught off guard by this. You have Turkey now kind of caught off guard, I think, initially being given permission in the president's Sunday night statement to move forward. Those were literally Trump's words, to move forward into Syria. And then this tweet that you allude to that came yesterday as we'll obliterate them if they do. How can any of us respond to that? I think what the president is alluding back to, if you will remember, when we had the episode over the imprisonment of the American pastor, Andrew Brunson, the United States began to put pressure on Turkey for his release. One of the key tipping points was when the U.S. applied very specific sanctions on Turkey, specifically because they were holding Americans. And the Turkish lira went into a free fall, and it was disastrous for the Turkish economy. And that seemed to be what began to precipitate negotiations that ended in Andrew Brunson's release, which was just about a year ago at this time. And so the president is kind of harking back to that. But this is tricky business, and there's nothing to say that new sanctions would necessarily decimate the Turkish economy. Turkish economy is not in great shape. But we're, on the one hand, we're propping up a leader who is not a great leader over Turkey, and then we're kind of pulling the rug out from under his feet. This is sending a signal to the entire watching world that the United States is not a reliable and, I would say, stable partner in economic endeavors, in military endeavors, diplomatic endeavors. This is going to not end well, I fear.
Talk about how this might involve Russia and certainly other nations in the region that are also perhaps, how do we call it, bad actors, untrustworthy and so on?
Turkey stepped into the Syrian civil war at a time when the Assad regime was on its heels and gave the Assad regime air cover. It gave them intelligence. It gave them strategic communications that it didn't have before that allowed the Assad regime to fight back. And essentially, I would say, in many ways, has won now the Syrian civil war. The government, with Russian backing, controls more than 3/4 of the country at this point. And so Russia has a deep stake in this region. Russia, if you'll remember going back during the time of the Cold War, Syria was aligned with Russia. It was a Cold War proxy in a sense in the Middle East. And that alliance has been revived. Russia and Turkey have an uneasy relationship, but it is increasingly cordial. Things have become tense between Turkey and its NATO allies. Turkey has increasingly turned to Russia. We saw a great debate over whether Turkey would accept and Russia would provide some missile defense armaments, and those in fact have happened. So we're seeing increasingly an alignment between Turkey and Russia. All of these things have sort of caught the United States and our European allies in NATO in the middle, and they have responded, I would say, not particularly well or particularly clearly on any of it. So Russia is going to be playing a decisive game here, whether they can in some way support the NATO posture in this region or whether they will fully support Syria, which means that they might go to war against Turkey if Turkey decides to invade Syria.
Yeah. Well, listen, I don't know what we can do at this point other than pray, and particularly pray for our brothers and sisters in that region. Whenever instability like this is introduced into the equation, there's a target, there's a convenient target that is on their backs, and there's a way that they become unintended consequences of decisions. And it's very, very troubling, and it's very disturbing. And we're hoping and praying that there'll be some sort of turnaround here and backing off of this decision. Mindy, I think one of the reasons I wanted to have you on, your knowledge of the region is so deep, and you understand what's going on, and you put out a weekly piece called Globetrot that people can follow. Tell people where they can sign up to get that update of what's happening around the world.
They can go to our website and connect with me there, or they can email me directly at mbelz@worldmag.com. We'll be continuing to follow it. And I do, John, in a way, I want to end somewhat on an upbeat note that the Christian populations in Iraq and Syria have been through so much. And it makes me sad that so much of it has been caused by bad decisions by the United States. But the reality is that this is a perfect bunch. And they have over and over again astonished us by their steadfastness, their belief in the importance of staying in this region, which is so close to the birthplace of Christianity and the growth of the early church. And so I think we can pray for them with hope that they aren't giving up, and that should give us courage and hope too.
Mindy Belz, the senior editor of World Magazine, the author of They Say We Are Infidels. You can follow Mindy on Twitter at @MCBelz. The website that she was mentioning where you can sign up for Globetrot is world.wng.org. That's world.wng.org. Mindy, thanks for from your undisclosed location somewhere with spotty phone reception. Thanks so much for jumping into this conversation and helping bring a little bit of clarity to it. Really appreciate you joining us on the BreakPoint podcast.
Thank you, John.
Thanks for listening to the BreakPoint podcast. To get your copy of Mindy Belz's outstanding book, They Say We Are Infidels, On the Run from ISIS with Persecuted Christians in the Middle East, come to our online bookstore at breakpoint.org. For the Colson Center, I'm Shane Morris.